Greetings, everyone. I'm Ramu Damodran with the University for Peace, and with the privilege of having had a long and cherished association with the International Association of University Presidents, which has organized today's event and was also responsible for proposing to the United Nations the idea of this International Day of Peace. And when it was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1982, we have a record of the Mexican delegate to the United Nations speaking of the appropriateness, if you will, of the 21st of September being that day, because in the Southern Hemisphere, it is a day when you move from the warmth and family and solitude of winter into the community renewal of spring, while in the Northern Hemisphere, it's a move from the exaltation of summer to the reflection of autumn or fall. So, as he said, every facet of the human personality and every facet of peace circles around on this one day. This year, the United Nations has chosen as the theme for the International Day, End Racism, Build Peace. But our conversation today, of course, goes within that and beyond that to the role of institutions of higher education in attaining the peace that we need. And to begin our conversation, I'm privileged to welcome and introduce Dr. Fernando Leon Garcia, President of the International Association of University Presidents and of CETYS in Mexico since 2010 at CETYS. He has led the institution in its accreditation in the United States and into one of the most internationalized universities in Mexico. And I'd like to usher in his remarks by quoting something he had said at the time of his inaugural as president of IUP. We are currently living in unprecedented times, a time of both opportunities and challenges, but above all, a moment that calls for institutions of higher education to rise to the occasion. It is in this context that the IOP seeks to provide an opportunity to learn from what is working and take note of what is not, and improve on what we must, reinventing and innovating, extending the boundaries of all we know. Fernando, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ramu. We appreciate your effort and your convocation, if you will, of all these colleagues to have this important conversation today. I'd also like to thank our colleagues who are joining us on the panel, Dr. Hilgi Vandeland, Secretary General of IAU, Dr. Rosenthal from the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs, Vice Chancellor Tandwa Matembu from Durban University of Technology, Vice Chancellor Raj Kumar from OP Jindal Global University in India, Dr. Yonghee Huang from Unai, Korea, and also Dr. Margaret Uberwimmer from Austria. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us in this important conversation. And I'll just try to be very brief and put our today's conversation into context. Let's reflect upon the world as it was in 1965, when a small, determined, and dedicated group of academic leaders decided to create this group, the International Association of University Presidents. The chill of the Cold War had frozen political relationships and spilled over into war in Southeast Asia. China had just explored an atomic bomb, bringing the number of countries that possessed nuclear weapons to 5. A civil rights movement based upon the equality of all races surged through the United States. Anger seethed among students in university campus around the world at what they saw as global greed, inequity, and injustice. A number of countries that had been colonies of European powers had gained their independence, but new tensions emerged, reflected, among others, by the war between India and Pakistan and the seeds of civil war in Nigeria. 20 years after the United Nations General Assembly first considered the question of the treatment of Indians in South America, the policies of apartheid continued unabated in that country. And yet there were signs of hope. the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination was unanimously adopted by the United Nations General Assembly that year, paving the way to two more landmark human rights treaties: the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. For us today, that last document is of particular relevance as it recognized the right of everyone to education, very important to us, and affirmed that education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and the sense of its dignity, and shall strengthen the respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. That education shall enable all persons to participate effectively in a free society, promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all nations and all racial, ethnic, or religious groups, and further the activities of the United Nations for the maintenance of peace. So it was in that pursuit of that furtherance that this organization began. As the very first sentence in its mission statement makes it clear, it is free of political and partisan interests. And as it goes on to say, its primary purpose is to strengthen the international mission and quality of higher education around the world. It offers a regular forum for higher education leaders and institutions to identify and discuss in a global and cross-cultural context the major issues and challenges facing higher education today. It is also an association committed to serving its members and the institutions they lead. Separately, each university leader has the ability to shape his or her own institution. Collectively, we have the ability to shape the entire landscape of higher education worldwide. As we saw during the pandemic, though, more and more, it is a matter of collaboration and of partnerships. 16 years after IUP began at its conference in San Jose, Costa Rica, the association suggested the idea of an International Day of Peace. The United Nations General Assembly endorsed the idea readily, possibly the first time that a unanimous global decision was based upon a proposal by a wholly non-governmental group rooted only in reason and scholarship. Today is that International Day, and we meet to reflect upon what our mission statement called the landscape of higher education, to consider what seeds we need to plant within it to build peace, and what weeds, like that of racism, we need to destroy to protect our space. I am grateful that we have so many distinguished minds and colleagues who have joined us for this conversation from Asia, where the hour is not the most convenient. Thank you to our colleagues from Europe. It's a little bit more acceptable, and from Africa and from the Americas as well. Some are old friends, others are friends I have not met before, but I hope that this brings us along and creates friendship for the future. I welcome you all. IUP and CETYS are in your debt. Thank you, Ram.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Fernando. And thank you for that vivid recap of the relationship between the IUP, this day, and the United Nations, and indeed the cause of higher education. And actually, when you talked about the IUP in 1965, it brought to mind a much later reflection of the world as it is in 2022, which I must attribute to our next speaker, Dr. Joel H. Rosenthal, the president of the Carnegie Council of Ethics in International Affairs. As a nonprofit leader, scholar, and teacher, he works to empower ethical action with a particular focus on US foreign policy, issues of war and peace, human rights, and pluralism. He's also the editor-in-chief of the widely read and widely respected Ethics in International Affairs. And the quote from Dr. Rosenthal, which I wanted to share with you, was in the context of an article he wrote earlier this year on the United Nations. And in a sense, you can picture that phrase being used in the year 1965, which shows how little what is essential has changed. Dr. Rosenthal wrote, "New ideas will be needed, systems put in place, and networks created. This will spur the emergence of novel models of leadership, likely to be intergenerational and more inclusive." Intergenerational, the power of education. Dr. Rosenthal, the floor is yours.
Ramu, thank you so much. Fernando, thank you so much for creating this opportunity and creating this moment for such elevated and important reflection. And the opportunity to do this together with you is really invaluable. So thank you for all you do, and thank you for this time. I'm speaking to you from my office in New York City. And many of you will know that the General Assembly is meeting now. And so this moment is sort of particularly poignant for me. And in fact, I can see the traffic as I look out my window. It's really quite an event here in the city. Ramu, as you said, the Secretary General gave us a frame for 2022 yesterday. And his remarks were noteworthy. I think the headlines were, "Our world is in peril." And the direct quote was, "We face a colossal global dysfunction." And that sense of crisis is very much present, I think, in the General Assembly today. So the point about 1965 to 2022 is well spoken. I also want to maybe reframe this, perhaps in yet another generation, bringing it back to the founding of our institution in 1914, a consequential year for peace, the efforts for peace, and the failures of the 20th century. Andrew Carnegie founded this institution in 2014, specifically on a mission for peace. For Carnegie, peace was not some lofty, abstract idea. It was a practical set of arrangements that he thought was within grasp in 1914. He could see the great power conflicts, much as we can see them today. And he said, we actually have the mechanisms to avoid conflict. And one of his first philanthropic ventures was the building of the Peace Palace at The Hague. And the idea was to bring the concept of law from the domestic scene to the international scene, and to create the institutions, and to create the ideas, and to create the body of law that would then allow us to have the peaceful resolution of conflict through elements like what's now the United Nations. Of course, we can reflect on what he got right and what he got wrong, perhaps another day. Essential for this conversation, though, getting back to Carnegie's view of the world, is he believed that we were progressing. We were progressing morally. And we could see the norms were shifting and changing over time. Again, the reference to 1965, very helpful. Civil rights, human rights. For Carnegie in his time frame, language would have been different, concept would have been the same. We no longer tolerate slavery. Human society has evolved morally. And when it came to peace, he thought the same thing would happen. He liked to use the example of dueling. In 1914, if two gentlemen have an argument, they no longer have a duel, right? We've evolved away from that. And he thought the same thing could happen when it had to do with war, that using machines, industrial war was sort of madness. It made no sense. And so we could find ways to move beyond that. And so it's just something I think is important for us to think about where we are in terms of our sort of moral evolution or lack thereof in today's society. He also married the idea of education and peace. And the fact that this group is meeting today would make perfect sense. His other great philanthropic initiative was libraries. He built public libraries all across the continental United States and the United Kingdom. And the idea was making knowledge accessible to more and more people. And the idea that knowledgeable people would be good citizens, and that would feed into this idea of peace. And so education and peace, I think, makes sense to think about them together. I want to make just sort of one observation about the current scene, and then I will retreat and listen to your conversation. I think that the crisis of internationalism that we're facing today and that we're hearing at the United Nations is acute. And I think one of the things that worries me most is that there are at least two clear alternative visions to internationalism that are competing with the sort of conventional idea that we see at the United Nations, and that we need to reckon with today. And these two competing visions are, again, not just theoretical, they're happening now in real time, and we can see them in our politics. The first vision is the vision of autocrats. And connecting to our theme of ending racism, I am sad to say a sense of ethno-nationalism that is very well articulated, and we're seeing play out in various political environments today. A blood and soil kind of nationalism based on ethnicity, based on identity, based on religion. And we see some of the results of this: closed borders, et cetera. And we have and by the way, we have architects and sort of practitioners of this work who proudly use the term illiberal. This is an illiberal view of society, and that's the blueprint that they are following. And we see this in higher education. Particularly, I can give you one example: Central European University in Hungary, which was hollowed out and virtually eliminated by the government there. And this is not just an isolated incident. I can report to you from the United States that Mr. Orban has visited Texas to visit with American conservatives to preach his view of an illiberal democracy as he understands it and as it's playing out in Hungary. So this is a worldview that is very much present today, and I think it's just an objective fact. A second worldview is a view of what I would call the new oligarchs, very different than an oligarch like Andrew Carnegie of 100+ years ago. These oligarchs are self-identified. These would be people like Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, to a different extent, Eric Schmidt. And they are seeking to exert their influence based on their resources and their wealth, including in higher education. Their view of world society is less regulations and, frankly, great skepticism of institutions, primarily like the institutions that most of you are either running or are associated with. They believe in super empowered individuals, a notion of heroic individualism, and they sort of prize the virtues of risk and disruption. And you see it playing out in various areas like cryptocurrencies, space travel, things of this nature. I think the point for this conversation is that they do see themselves as disruptors, and they seem to have placed little emphasis on solidarity around the global scale issues that are being discussed right now today at the United Nations. And they spend most of their time thinking about both commercial interests and individual interests. And the relationship to state interests is somewhat ambiguous. So I'll leave you with one thought. I do believe that we need to get back to some clear view of responsible internationalism that is articulated, that builds solidarity around the kind of work that you do. And if it doesn't come from higher education, it certainly needs to involve higher education, because there are competing worldviews out there that are not friendly. So I hope that this is a constructive contribution to the discussion, but I did feel like we needed to sort of start off with a big frame and some sense of realism as we move forward on this very important agenda for peace and ending racism. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you for that very necessary, sobering, and perhaps sad dose of realism. That wonderful phrase that you used about exultant individualism, if you will, could have been something at the heart of education, to create individuals who are secure in themselves and secure within their communities, so not remaining outside or in their own perception above their communities. And that's in many ways an idea that informs the work of our next speaker and the organization that she leads, Dr. Hylike van 't Land, who is the Secretary General of the International Association of Universities, which celebrated its 70th anniversary just 2 years ago. And for the past 2 decades, she has been the main focal point for higher education in societal transformation, supervising the overall program activities of the IAU and its relationship with institutions around the world. Just last week, Hylike gave an interview to the University World News on the eve of their annual conference, which is scheduled to be held in Dublin next month, where she called for ESTEAM, E-S-T-E-A-M, instead of STEM. And that stands for Education, Science, Technology, Arts, and Maths Education. In her words, if we want to move into the future with the kind of citizens that have an appreciation for diversity and in the appreciation of connecting the unconnected, to go back to Joel's remarks, for innovating and appreciating how we want to actually address the global challenges we face, we have a unique opportunity to educate students as critical thinkers and as engaged citizens. Hylike, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ramu, and thank you for having invited me to this esteemed group of people. I'm very pleased and honored to be speaking with the many that are around this virtual table. It's very nice to celebrate together this International Day of Peace, especially since there are so many challenges to peace, as Joel, Fernando, and yourselves already started to indicate and stress again. We have so much more to do in order for the future to be in a better place than it is today. And the IAU, as you said, is indeed an organization that is closely linked to IAUP. That's also why it's very interesting to be speaking here today. We both go a very long way. We just celebrated 70 years, the IAUP 60 years. We were created on similar basis to actually strengthen international cooperation at the highest level of higher education and for all those involved into higher education at all the different levels. The IAU, like the IAUP, but maybe in a different way, but not that different in the end, is a facilitator and a promoter of a different kind of internationalization, an internationalization for all, in which all the different voices of nations, of people, of culture are represented and heard equally. And that hearing those voices equally is what is still not happening. We still have dominant voices. And Joel, you had, I very much liked what you said, also these tensions about the new voices that we hear that are so loud, too loud for us, and are actually disrupting these dynamics that were moving the world in the right direction. And I don't know to what extent the pandemic that we've just lived through has, to a certain point, also allowed to exacerbate these oppositions, as we actually hoped for the contrary, because we saw that throughout the pandemic, we needed to work more together instead of less together. We needed to create new grounds for international collaboration, research jointly developed, etc., to be able to address something that was affecting everyone around the world, and everyone had a voice at the table to indicate where we should go to find the solutions to this pandemic that was hitting us all. And we come out of it weakened, which is very bizarre to me. And to the higher education community as well, because we should have come out of this stronger, and we should have seen an opportunity to transform our world into a better place. But that said, it's not too late. We have to work together very much more so. Internationalization or global engagement is for all students, young and old, to grow as global responsible citizens who will be the promoters of collaboration in research and more. They will be able to then find the answers to the most pressing issues that we face. As you say also, and again, your words, if we go back to more individual approaches to everything that we face in the world, we will never get anywhere. We have, as higher education institutions, unique opportunity to bring the different stakeholders inside the institution and outside the institution together to think together. Higher education is a key actor in the peace processes. It tailors to millions of students and staff around the world. It is intrinsically linked to all other education levels from pre-primary to lifelong. It needs to reinforce its role to help build peace in the minds of people, even more so now that peace is challenged in too many countries. And it's on those bases that the IAU was created by UNESCO in 1948. We just came out of 2 world wars then. We have been very much afraid that we would these days again roll into a 3rd world war. Many voices have been talking about it. We're not there, but we have to be very careful that we never get there. And I was very pleased to hear at the conference of the non-aligned that President Modi from India said that this is no time for war. And good that he said so, and that was picked up by many also at the UNGA just this week. When I heard President Macron repeat those words in his address to the UNGA, he took no less than 29 minutes in his speech to underline the importance of education to build a better world, more peace, more solidarity, more social justice, more multilateral cooperation, all these ingredients that we need to build a better world and that we can actually activate through higher education. Yet we see higher education being challenged by agendas that are not necessarily conducive to facilitating the kind of education that we need today. We're far too often seeing the universities pressured by commodification agendas, by moving away from higher education as a common global good, higher education that needs to be developed on efficacy, efficiency agendas. We take out the flexibility that is needed in order for peace, justice, education to thrive. And so we have a very important role to play as associations as well, IAUP, IAU, but also all the other international associations of universities to help universities around the world to set the future direction right and to really focus more strongly on where we need to go when it comes to what is it that we want when we educate the millions of students and staff that go through higher education. So the IAU is really insisting a lot on value-based higher education, where the notions of university autonomy, academic freedom, access and success in higher education, integrity, equity, academic integrity for research, ethical behavior, tolerance of divergent opinions, solidarity, international understanding, and cooperation are so incredibly important. Yet there is not much and not enough space for these values to be fostered as they should in our systems. And I would hope that on this International UN Day for Peace, we would have an opportunity to really say to the higher education community, let's not forget about these values, but on the contrary, foster them. So we need to learn to live better together, to respect these basic values, to underpin the quality of higher education, and to really develop through all the different functions of a university, teaching and learning, research, campus operations, social engagement. We need to develop democracy with respect, understanding of the other, and freedom of thought and the like. So I have examples that I will be able to share later in the conversation, but I really believe that this is where we should go in the future. hammer on the importance of global cooperation and on focusing the importance of higher education on these values that should underpin anything that is happening in these institutions that are so crucial to build a better future together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hiligi. And thank you for that very, very apt reminder that we normally come out of crises like the pandemic stronger rather than weaker. We came out of it in 1945 and created the United Nations. And perhaps in a sense that may be because in 1945, we were looking back to the legacy of 1936 and 37, when there was yet hope. Just as today, we should be looking back to 2018 and 2019, rather than being daunted by the last 2 years. And the question of legacy is, I know, something very central to the thinking of our next speaker, a cherished friend, Dr. Thandwa Mthembu, who is the Vice Chancellor of the Durban University of Technology, and who I know will bring to this conversation the precision of mathematics, which is his chosen vocation. He joined Durban University in 2016 as Vice Chancellor, and before that, he was the Vice Chancellor and Principal of the Central University of Technology in the Free State in South Africa, where he was very gracious and generous host for an IUP meeting in Bloemfontein in 2013. When he was inaugurated as Vice Chancellor of DOT, Thandwa said, "It is time our young people find a new legacy," going back to what he said, Hiligi. That legacy should not just be a shadow of past legacies, struggle, past chants, past songs, past dances. It should be a fresh and bright new light that shines on South Africa, a legacy that should be like a ripened fruit for all of us to enjoy. A metaphor which could work for education, the United Nations, and certainly the world itself. Thandwa, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ramu, for that very nice and generous introduction. And I should also thank my friend Fernando, my president of the IUP, and all the distinguished guests that are in attendance tonight. It's really a great honor to have been invited to speak on such an important day, the International Day of Peace. And around the time when so much is happening in the world and when leaders are meeting, dealing with all of these critical issues we face as the world. Ramu introduced me as a mathematician, but mathematics has never been able to resolve the issue of peace. So I'm on the back foot on that. It shows that many other fields of endeavor, of intellectual endeavor, are very important, because I think rather than looking at mathematics, perhaps you could look at how societies live. You could look at, once you focus on society or societies, you can then think about maybe social theories that actually help to unite society instead of encouraging perpetual wars and conflicts in society. So you'll find that critical theory as a social theory that aims to critique and change society is much more relevant than mathematics in the discussion tonight. And when I think about critical theory and what its role is, one of the people I always think about is Jürgen Habermas, who actually, with his theory of communicative action, deals with social order. Because when we look at society, we've got to look at what binds society. And we have to look at what social order is. And Jürgen Habermas talks about the capacity of actors in society to recognize intersubjective validity of the different claims on which social cooperation depends. Because what leads to conflicts, what leads to wars, is the lack of that recognition of intersubjective validity of the different claims. And when you look at the war between Ukraine and Russia, and some arguments from people who will argue on what happened in 1945 at the end of the Second World War, what agreements were reached, and so forth, forgetting to recognize that intersubjective validity of the different claims, because there are claims now of people who probably had not been born in 1945 when whatever agreements were made. So I want to spend a few minutes on what I'm calling deliberative and sustainable peace, and how, in my view, whether we look at the international level, what is happening currently, war in Ukraine, or whether we're looking at our own national situations, and I would say in particular our own as South Africans, or we look at what is currently happening at our universities in this country, I do think that these two words, deliberative and sustainable, are very, very important. And again, going back to Habermas, Jürgen, and he's of course written, many people in this audience know better about him than a mathematician does. His writings also focus on different types of democracy we have in the world, deliberative democracy, which I think is most suited in a university setting, because unlike the maybe participative and aggregation of views from different parts of society, the aggregative democracy, we in universities depend on reason and logic, on facts and evidence, on deliberation, and therefore that form of democracy is most important, the deliberative form of democracy, to get things done, where the best ideas, excellence, where it doesn't matter how many people support a popular idea, if there is evidence that it's not the best idea, and that evidence comes via the minority of people in a particular society or in a particular university, that's what at a university we would feel is the best thing to follow. So I've already mentioned that what is happening in the Ukraine lacks what Jürgen Habermas tries to warn us about, that we've got to think about our reality in terms of all the ideas that are on the table, and understand that we always have to come up with something that makes sense in that situation, rather than perhaps whatever historical situation you may have. And that takes me also to the word sustainability. And of course, I like the Brundtland definition of sustainability, which is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So at the international level, you could look at what is happening now in Ukraine. You could think about whatever needs, whoever has the needs currently, and what they are doing in order to safeguard or sustain those needs or provide for those needs. You could ask the question whether that is not compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So that's why I chose both deliberative and sustainable peace, because I think these two elements, deliberative and sustainable, are very important for us as the higher education sector to take lessons. Now, coming to our own national situation, most of the world knows very well about our hero, Nelson Mandela, who really chose for our country a deliberative and sustainable approach, in my view. And there are many critics of what he did for our country. And I like what Hiligia said earlier about agendas that are all over the place, that are based on race, based on all sorts of things that are not about uniting us, but dividing us perpetually. Nelson Mandela chose the path of peace as opposed to war and unending conflict in our country. And that seems to have been forgotten, because many people are asking, where are we as a country in light of whatever some of us might claim about the contributions Nelson Mandela made. But I think we'll eventually go back to where he started us, because right now there is so much disunity everywhere, based on ideology, based on race, based on ethnicity, based on many things. And the only way we can survive as a country, or any country, is to understand, again, Allah Habemus, is that there are all sorts of intersubjective validities that are there in our society that need to be negotiated amongst members of society. So to become too essentialist about, like in this country, about what was lost in 1652 when the Dutch came to this country, or what was lost during apartheid, might not take us anywhere. And in fact, if you go back to the Brundtland definition of sustainability, it doesn't say that sustainable development is about looking perhaps at the most vulnerable in terms of what they need now and what they will need in the future. It talks about development that meets the needs of the present without subcategorizing the population, because when you begin to do that, as I think we do in our country, you are not going to have unity, you are not going to have peace, because you are trying to cater, in as much as those you might think are most important to be catered for are really the most needy. But if you leave out any section of society that probably has the potential to continue to generate resources even for the most needy, then you are going astray. So I'm really hoping that our universities, coming now to the institutional, from the national to the institutional, could, going back to the agendas that we have in our country, we now have student movements that are overly politicized, that perhaps pay less attention to student issues and the politics of being young and the needs of the young people, to all sorts of issues that are very, very important, but move them into an arena that could also be described as anti-intellectual. Anti-intellectual in the sense that threats, violence, intimidation, and so on, which is what we see in our country, not only within our universities, but all across society. Those are things that are anti-intellectual, as I said earlier, but are not going to breed unity and peace in our country. So I'm hoping that with all the agendas that come into our universities through political parties or any other type of agenda, that we will soon realize as universities, our students will soon realize that all of those external influences, all of those ideologies that come from all across, the university is a deliberative space. It's not about the might of the majority of the voices. It's about practicing a deliberative type of democracy within the university, which is based on facts and evidence, reason and deliberation, and that's the only way to go. And I think there is hope. I've had a number of discussions with our student leaders, and I can see that the more we can engage with our student leaders, especially in this country, about things that other countries take for granted, how students behave, a value and principle-based kind of strategy for the university, as we do have at Durban University of Technology, that very slowly we'll be able to return our universities and our country to more deliberation, to more broader notions of sustainability that do not make our students destroy the little that they have because they've got the needs at present, and yet what they are destroying is not going to make future generations satisfy their own needs. Thank you very much, Rama.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Thandwa, and thank you for really bridging the international with the national, and if I may say so without being presumptuous, a national in which all of us outside South Africa have in a sense been so intimately involved by our conscience at the United Nations, and yes, intellectually. And as all of us know, Nelson Mandela famously spoke of education as the most powerful weapon you can use to transform the world. And I'm humbled to be in the midst of so many gentle wielders of that weapon. You spoke also, Thandwa, about deliberation and sustainability. And I think the wonderful phrase that you used about a deliberative democracy or a deliberative peace, that really speaks, if I may say so, to your skills as a mathematician, because even if a mathematician cannot contribute to the process of peace, he contributes the idea of quiet deliberation that underlies that, and which also, in a way, suggests the society of the future, which our next speaker has envisaged. And I'm proud to welcome Dr. Chokalingam Rajkumar, who is the founder, vice-chancellor of the O.P. Jindal Global University in India. He took over the position of vice-chancellor after having suggested the idea and designed the university, and he was barely 34 when he became VC. And in an article last year in the Times of India, he said, and this really resonates with what Thandwa just said, universities have been forums of knowledge creation and exchange, and they continue to play an instrumental role in transforming nations into knowledge societies. And I think that is another endeavor in which all of you are intimately involved. Dr. Rajkumar, please.
Thank you very much, Ramu, for inviting me. It's such a pleasure for me to be part of this very critical International Association of University Presidents virtual event, especially as we celebrate the International Day of Peace. I want to mention that it's so wonderful to be part of fellow travelers in the larger vision of higher education as well as institution building, an opportunity that gives us to engage with young people. In fact, one of the remarkable things about being part of a higher education institution is the potential it holds to create a future with greater degree of optimism when it comes to achieving peace and ending racism, which is part of this year's theme as well. Now, let me quickly begin by saying that the idea of peace is actually, as we all know, is not about absence of war. It's about creating a society in which the larger goals of social and economic development, as the UNDP would call it, the human development, is achieved with a view to ensuring that we create resilient societies where there is respect for each other and there is ability to advance that. So in that sense, the role of higher education institutions becomes absolutely critical, because To begin with, the higher education institutions are creating opportunities for young people to fulfill their meaningful objectives of life, including their careers, but also imparting knowledge and expertise and skills, which ultimately can shape the future. If you look at the country like India with 1.4 billion people, the reality is 900 million people are less than 35 years of age. If you look at the world itself, you see the youth population over 1 billion plus, and that means these young people are in a position to be influenced, empowered, and even enhanced in terms of their approach and ideas towards peace. And that is why the role of higher education institutions is so critical. The second reason why we need to take this role seriously is the fact that higher education institutions have been at the forefront of promoting powerful ideas that can shape the future. Academic freedom and autonomy and independence have been the foundations of universities around the world. And as one of our speakers mentioned, those values have been threatened in recent times in societies around the world. It becomes even more important for us in higher education institutions to steadfastly guard against these internal and external threats that potentially undermine the ability of higher education institutions to promote powerful ideas that will preserve notions of peace. It's also equally important that one of the things that universities and higher education institutions do is to engage in research and to work towards speaking truth to power. Now, speaking truth to power becomes important at all times, but especially now when the idea of intellectual spirit of inquiry and evidence-based policymaking, all of which have been challenged in societies around the world. It is during these times that higher education institutions have a very significant role to address these challenges. I want to quickly move towards what we can potentially do when you look at addressing the issue of discrimination on the one hand, but also creating peaceful societies. Well, to begin with, we need to listen and educate ourselves. We need to pay attention to the voices of people who experience these challenges every day, listen and engage with especially young people so that they can become responsible adults in the future. The second thing we need to do is to raise awareness, share the resources that we have found useful with the community, and to help them learn how they can play a role in building resilience, creating peace, and of course, ending other forms of discrimination and racism, which will undermine the ability of societies to build peace. We also need to challenge efforts to create violence in societies. And this is a challenge that we are universally facing. The normalization of violence within societies need to be addressed and addressed in a robust manner. And that's where universities and higher education institutions can play a very salutary role. We also need to make the university and workplace much more safer and ensure that the well-being of the community is reflected in the ethos and values of these institutions. In some ways, when you look at the idea of peace, it has been contested in more recent times, and I cannot help but to reflect that even after over 150 years of later, since Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy of non-violence as the measure for peace building was promoted, his approach cuts across time, space, context, culture, geography, and indeed the state of development in a society. His own political philosophy inspired many movements, including against colonialism and apartheid, both of which were essential in maintaining these structures. But I also have to mention that his ideas of civil disobedience and non-cooperation inspired generation of leaders in the 50s and 60s, including Martin Luther King, as well as it was mentioned earlier, Nelson Mandela. Now, in a way, the role of higher education institutions is today's response to what is happening around the societies. We need to inculcate a deeper sense of engagement among our young people. Higher education institutions need to challenge and resist the temptation to adopt easy approaches towards addressing complex problems. We need to embrace complexity and work towards addressing issues that are undermining our ability to build peaceful societies. As I conclude, I want to say that, building peace in society, while we work towards it, we also need to learn values of forgiveness. I would like to end by quoting what Nelson Mandela said as he walked out of the Robben Island prison after 18 years after over 2 decades of imprisonment. And I quote, "As I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I would still be in prison," unquote. I want to mention this because of the fact that if you look at the challenge of societies that are coming out of transitions, one of the big challenges that we are facing today is that to what extent they can reconcile with their past and build a future that not only respects the possibility of building peace in the future, but also to reconcile with the past. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission that South Africa undertook that effort was one way by which they were able to address the challenges of the past while preparing for the future. So it is indeed a significant task that higher education institutions have taken upon itself, but I'm confident there is no other institution in society which are best suited to build societies that can commit itself to peace and also to empower young people to commit themselves, but more importantly, fulfill their own goals and aspirations within the context of building a society that is committed to peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Rajkumar. And your mention of Mahatma Gandhi brought to mind that in the city where he started his struggle, Durban, and the Durban University of Technology, which Tandwa heads, we have an International Center of Nonviolence, and I'm very grateful that its director, Dr. Crispin Hemson, and others are joining us for this event. The point that you made, Dr. Rajkumar, about race, in a sense, separating and being acknowledged because it separates, leads in many ways to the rationale of much of the work being done by the next speaker, which shows even where we have separations, it is possible to bridge them without trying to subsume them in a single identity. I've been privileged to know Dr. Margareta Uberwimmer for a number of years. She's with the University of Applied Sciences in Upper Austria at its campus in Steyr. And she has been a pioneer in what I would call the cross-cultural movement, looking at cross-cultural motivations and particularly their impetus and relevance for business, for economic relations. And I was very struck when I saw that one of the projects that she led was cross-culture between 2 neighboring provinces, even though they were in separate countries, a province in the Czech Republic, in Bohemia, South Bohemia, and that in Austria, and how they were able to find both differences and reconciliations within them. So with that, let me hand it over to you, Marguerite, for your thoughts.
Thank you so much, dear Ramu. Thank you, Fernando, for inviting me on this special day. Best greetings from Upper Austria in the heart of Europe. And days like these make me think a lot. Today we celebrate more or less International Day of Peace. And what we learned is that war came back to Europe this year. We are all convinced that peace and personal health are among the most important prerequisites for leading a self-determined life. And I'm still, and I'm always have been deeply convinced that education, and again, education is the non plus ultra for society. We need people who think critically and who live and act self-reflectively. And I like the wording, building bridges through education and research. And just let me give you some examples of our practical life in Upper Austria, what we do. And as I'm responsible for study programs, having 50% internationals included, and researching on global business management, we have acquired lots of knowledge on our own. So it's our own learning how to deal with different cultures. And let me just stress out, because this was also the point, I got in touch with Ramu, with persons of the team of Fernando and of your esteemed universities. That's a so-called cross-cultural business conference, which we already run the 12th time next year, where 80 to 100 researchers come to Upper Austria, to Steyr, and discuss topics of cross-cultural and international collaboration. Focusing on business, but it is a scientific conference, and I like the social networking with our researchers coming partly from different disciplines, coming from various nations around the globe, and we find topics to discuss with each other. Some new research opportunities might appear during the cross-cultural business conference, and people come back again from year to year. And I still memorize 2014 when Ramu gave the keynote, and he was already presenting your institutions, the ideas of the United Nations, and gave a huge impact to our cross-cultural business conference. As I said before, for me personally, building bridges through education is important. We have set up a triple degree program with CETYS University, so with Fernando's University and with an Asian university, where we want to bring young people together. They study for 2 years at master and MBA level, and first they start in their home universities, then the 3 destinations meet in Mexico, then they move together to Asia, and then they come back to Austria, and finally they leave Austria, Mexico, and Asia as friends. They finalize their 3 degrees, and what they have learned during their student's journey is definitely to increase the intercultural competences. We really believe that increasing the intercultural sensitivity is of huge importance, especially of youth in these days. And you all know what is important to increase this sensitivity. It's an ongoing lifelong learning process. Yeah, on the one hand, our students have to increase their cognitive competencies. Yeah, they should know about other cultures. They should know about other countries. They should acquire country-specific knowledge. They can do this during their studies abroad, but they really have to inherit the culture, know a little bit more about other cultures, and willing to learn about other cultures from the cognitive perspective. A second point, which is necessary to increase the sensitivity, is the affective competences. Our students have to gain empathy, to learn to understand the feelings of the others. And there are thirdly the pragmatic competences. So they should simply be able to communicate with all kinds of cultures, with people, and they should be able also to solve conflict situations and to find strategies to resolve conflicts. In our times, I'm deeply convinced increasing those intercultural competences are a key for successful and peaceful living together, and especially also as we focus for business management educations for successful businesses and management. Companies, at least in Austria, are aware about that fact. However, we experience that not much efforts are put in educating people in their intercultural competences. And I'm very, very happy that, also we have talked a lot about increasing this intercultural competences here in Europe. Now, at least in our region, we start with certain programs to educate people, to educate society in order also to make Austria a little bit more intercultural sensitive. As I said, it's an ongoing lifelong learning process, and it has a lot to do with self-reflection. Yes, what our students also learn is to be innovative, to think out of the box, to be able to trigger innovations cross-culturally. And for that, we are always a little bit creative to find new forms of events like the so-called InnoCamp 36, which is sponsored by companies and they sponsor the students, and they give them a challenge questions. And students have 36 hours time to solve this question, to find solution and to pitch their ideas in the end. Students are coached by our professors, and we apply, for instance, design thinking in the international teams. And this year, so we start with the InnoCamp next month again, lots of companies sponsor topics in order to make their businesses more sustainable. And this contributes definitely to the SDGs. And as Ramu said, yes, we collaborate a lot, not only in education internationally, but as I said before, building bridges through education and research, we also research together internationally. I guess this is really a basis where we researchers have to talk with each other, share different opinions and mindsets. And we do this with American friends. We do also research together, as Ramu said beforehand, with the South Bohemian region, which is really close to the Austrian border, and Austria is really small. South Bohemia is also small. Nevertheless, we know, although we have a common history together, partly long time ago, our cultures are so different. And even we as researchers experience during our collaboration, sometimes it's hard to collaborate together, but as we are willing to collaborate with each other, we always find a solution. Yeah, but we have to understand how the others behave, how the others think, what are the cultural differences. And as long as there is an empathy, we always find a solution. That way, also a common research can be successful. And yeah, topics which are burning topics also for companies, at least in Europe, are topics like artificial intelligence. I know our US American friends are forerunners, also Asian friends are forerunners in those topics. In our project with South Bohemia, we want to make a small difference because we want to boost AI applications also towards our small, medium-sized companies. But we do it a little bit differently because we take those stress moments of companies, of people very seriously. And we have an eye on AI application from the technology side, from the value side for companies, for users, for customers, and from the ethical side. And we involve in those research activities, not only companies, but also students, our students from the university, from our South Bohemian partner university. And yeah, we take their considerations serious in that way. Yeah, important in such research projects for us is always reflection, critical discussions, and elaborating values, and make people aware about their fears and challenges. Tomorrow we start with our new students cohort for the triple degree, which we run together with CETYS University. And when I see our youth, I stay optimistic also in those times. We try to bring together different nations, and we try to build bridges through education and research. And that's what I also appreciate in your esteemed society and organization. What I wish to all of us is peace, and let's make a difference through education and research. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Margaret. And And thank you also for spotlighting the role, if you will, of Austria. It's the home of the first organization to be set up by the United Nations. The very first resolution of the UN General Assembly in 1946 set up the International Atomic Energy Agency. And Austria has also been home to intellectual freedom. Joel mentioned the case of the Central European University, which was closed down in Budapest and is now relocated to Vienna. And of course, all of us are grateful to the University of Applied Sciences of Austria, to President Gerald Reisinger, for having hosted the triennial of the IUP in 2017 in lovely Vienna. Now, at that triennial, there was an instance of what you, Margaret, would call pragmatic competence. And that was young people, students getting together under the aegis of ASPIRE, the United Nations Association to Support Innovation and Reform Through Education, which is an offshoot of the United Nations Academic Impact. And we've had ASPIRE chapters around the world, but none have been so active as that in Korea. And that's really thanks to our next speaker, Yuni Hwang, of the Association of Korean Universities in support of the United Nations Academic Impact. I should mention that this association was established by President Kim Yong-gil of Hamdong Global University, who himself was one of the leaders of IUP until his sad passing 2 years ago. Yuni has been a very gracious friend of IUP. When I invited her to join the conference, despite the fact that it's now probably 2 a.m. in Seoul, she did not hesitate for a moment before saying yes, and she looks as cheerful as ever. Over to you, Yuni. Your mic, please, Yuni. Sorry. Thanks.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Ramo, and I'm so grateful for joining you today, and then I could get really very interesting ideas from you. Today I would like to share how higher education institutions work for a more sustainable and peaceful world by contributing to achieve SDGs and ESG in Korea. So I would like to share the successful case, and in that the role of UN Academic Impact Korea to enable a city to achieve ESG through collaboration with other stakeholders. Maybe I will be the only one who wants to share some slides with you. So can I share my screen? SDG and ESG, we have enough acronyms already on our globe. Yes, we do. But these two acronyms may actually be the most influential acronyms in the history of human beings, I believe. So maybe in 20 or 30 years, everybody, even every kid, will know exactly what they mean. So I do not need to tell what SDG stands for here today, but please let me mention that ESG refers to measurable factors that represent sustainable practice. Here, I would like to mention more about ESG. ESG refers to the 3 key factors: environment, social, and governance, when measuring the sustainability and ethical impact of an investment in a business or a company. It is a generic term used in capital market and commonly used by investors to evaluate the behavior of companies as well as determining their future financial performance. It has become increasingly popular with investors who want to invest responsible while still making profit. However, ESG is not an issue only for the companies or investors. ESG is a part of SDGs. ESG is a subset of SDGs. ESG can be used to measure environmental, social, and governance practices within an organization, including company. By incorporating sustainable development practices into daily operations, organizations can achieve success through the use of ESG factors, which will eventually integrated with SDGs. Thus, ESG in relation to the UN SDGs is to guide companies and organizations for sustainable development practices. Indeed, SDG has less power over enforcing its goals. However, SDG with ESG factors becomes a strong platform to promote its goals and encourage organizations to follow them. UN Academic Impact Korea, Korean Association in support of UN Academic Impact, we have focused on strengthening global citizenship education, which is a cross-cutting issues for achieving SDGs. And we established Ban Ki-moon Institute for Global Education and Kim Young-gil Grade School in Handong Global University to provide diverse formal and informal global citizenship education programs. Our critical work indeed was initiated by Dr. Remu Damodaran, who made a significant contribution to enforce global citizenship education with the initiative of UN Academic Impact in UN. Recently, for us to attain SDGs in more impactful way and to bring more peaceful and sustainable world, we integrated ESG to global citizenship education program. So the program included content for ESG. First, for increasing awareness on ESG, such as what is ESG, what is so important, how to achieve it in successful cases. And second, capacity building to achieve ESG. So defining competences for that and how to increase them working in the field. But our program differs in some respect from other education programs on ESG. Who practices ESG? It's us, people. So although ESG is a useful tool to bring sustainable and peaceful world, if people do not use well, it cannot make an achievement. So our program integrated with ESG stresses the ethical values and attitudes that one must embrace and demonstrate as global citizens, and dealing with the ways in which leaders create and maintain an ethical culture with an organization and society. However, ESG cannot be fully achieved by education program from an NGO, from just one development from NGO or just education execution from school. All stakeholders in the community, NGO, school, company, government should collaborate for our mutual and sustainable growth. So we recently made a platform where academy, NGO, company, and government can work together to practice ESG. ESG Pohang. We started our initiative to achieve ESG through education in the city of Pohang, which is located in southern part of Korea. Pohang is the city where it's both the site of one of the world's largest steel complex and two of Korean most forward-looking universities, Post-Tech and Handong Global University. So to transform Pohang City from heavy industrial city to sustainable city, we for practicing ESG, local government Pohang City had a demand to change themselves. And UN Academic Impact Korea proposed to educate city hall officers by instilling the mindset of global citizenship, global leadership, and increasing capacity enough to practice ESG. The pilot education program went well, and UN Academic Impact Korea and Pohang City become so ambitious. So we are so ambitious, and we enlarged our perspective to transform the whole of Pohang City, where every member will be able to practice ESG for sustainable and peaceful city. So in addition to educating city hall officers, we recently include private companies in Pohang. UN Academic Impact Korea provides education programs, and Handong Global Universities teach them, and companies will practice ESG, and Pohang City will offer the benefits to companies who are satisfying the standards, such as tax reductions, and then just providing the office for free by building up a startup center. In Korea, indeed, there are lots of initiatives and support programs for ESG these days between government and company. However, our program is different because the driving force of our program is education. Basically, basis of the program, the ANGO, UN Academic Impact Korea, developed all the educational content, and Handong Global University execute them. And the member of all Pohang City will be able to practice it based on the mindset and capacity built through the education. So I believe this makes the initiative of ESG Pohang makes more impactful and more sustainable. I would like to end my speech here by sharing our long-term aim. It is to make our initiative as a strong model to change Pohang City, and if possible, we want to extend the same movement to the other cities in Korea. Thank you again, Ramu, for this beautiful occasion, and thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yoon-hee. And thank you really for putting the idea of global citizenship on the map. It was a concept which really owes itself at the United Nations to some distinguished citizens of Korea. The first person to propose it was our Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, when he launched the Education First initiative in 2009, which included global citizenship. And then when the General Assembly debated the Sustainable Development Goals, at the instance of the Korean delegation to the United Nations, Ambassador Han Chung-hee in particular, GC education was incorporated in that. As Joel mentioned, this has been a very busy week at the United Nations, so one of our speakers was not able to join us in person, but has recorded a message with which we will conclude this program. I'd like to invite the permanent representative of India to the United Nations, Ruchira Kamboj. She's the first woman ambassador of India to the UN, and she also has a great deal in common with many of you. She has been India's High Commissioner to South Africa and earlier Consul General in Cape Town. She's been India's permanent representative to UNESCO, where actually, Tanva, she led a conference on the concept of zero. And she has also been at the Indian mission to the United Nations earlier as a counselor. So we have a recorded message from Ambassador Kamboj.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, my greetings to all as we commemorate together the International Day of Peace. I will say that the theme of today's event is most relevant as we continue to witness discrimination and violence based on racism. This rightly calls for ending an abhorrent act, racism, to build peace. Congratulations to the organizers for this excellent initiative. Racism is the antithesis to a spirit of humanity as a country that was under colonial rule for nearly 2 centuries. India is painfully aware of the detrimental impact of racism and racial discrimination on society. The scourge of slavery affected millions of Indians who were driven out from their motherland by the colonial powers to far-off shores as indentured labor, which Mahatma Gandhi called a remnant of slavery. The fight against racism and racial discrimination and decolonization have hence been the cornerstones of India's foreign policy since independence. The multilateral framework for our contemporary obligation to act against this evil practice is grounded in the 1926 Convention to Suppress Slavery and the Slave Trade, adopted by the League of Nations, and its supplementary conventions adopted by us here at the United Nations. In 1946, many of you would recall that India was the first country to raise its voice against apartheid at the United Nations. We've always regarded racism and racial discrimination as the antithesis of everything that humanity stands for: equality, justice, peace, and progress. It is a negation of the Charter of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Durban Declaration and Programme of Action, adopted in 2001, continue to provide a comprehensive framework for combating racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. The implementation of this declaration is also important for achieving the UN-mandated Sustainable Development Goals. May I also draw your attention to the Arc of Return. The unveiling of this beautiful permanent memorial in honor of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade at the United Nations in March 2015 was a testament to the widespread commitment of the international community to ensure that we never forget this pernicious stain on the history of humankind. India's voluntary contribution of US $260,000 to the United Nations Trust Fund for Partnerships, which contributed towards the installation of this memorial, was a visible manifestation of our continued commitment to this objective. Ladies and gentlemen, colonialism was rooted in the notion of racial superiority. Millions suffered from racist exploitation, so did Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. To resist colonialism and racial discrimination, he forged the weapon of satyagraha, or truth and non-violence. With truth and non-violence as a weapon, he led India to freedom. In our own national context, inspired by Mahatma Gandhi and guided by the legacy of Dr. Ambedkar and other social reformers, the government of India is committed to combating and eliminating discrimination in all its manifestations. The Indian Constitution enshrines safeguards against racism and racial discrimination. These safeguards are further strengthened by our comprehensive legal framework with an independent and impartial judiciary, a pluralistic polity, a vibrant civil society, and free media. Looking ahead, education will undoubtedly be one of our strongest weapons to fight racism. And here I must compliment the activities undertaken by education institutes around the world, particularly the University for Peace, to promote the ideas of tolerance and understanding. This advocacy should continue. Furthermore, in today's digital age, we need to focus on harnessing the power of the ICTs to foster the values of global citizenship. Online education in civics and history are potent tools that remain underutilized. We can maximize digital dividends by promoting civic education through digital platforms against combating the resurgent trends of racism and racial discrimination. In an interconnected world, social media has emerged as a platform for amplifying racial hatred and discriminatory ideas. This trend, if unchecked, could potentially pose a challenge to social cohesion. We also need to carry out effective outreach efforts to enhance the national and international consciousness as we strengthen collectively our resolve to end racial discrimination, which is rooted in the false notion of racial superiority. Member states must intensify efforts to prevent and combat racial hatred and discrimination, taking into consideration the balance between safeguarding the freedom of speech and expression. Partnerships with the private sector and civil society are also critical in this context. Ladies and gentlemen, my country rests on the firm foundations of democracy, pluralism, equality, and justice. These principles are the most definitive guarantee against racial prejudice, discrimination, and xenophobia. Prime Minister Modi has said, and I quote, "So far as the government is concerned, there is only one holy book, which is the Constitution of India. My government will not tolerate or accept any discrimination based on caste, creed, and religion," unquote. As I conclude, let me state that India will continue to play its role in our collective fight against racism and racial discrimination anywhere and everywhere. In our view, ending racism is a prerequisite to building peace. Thank you.
On that note, allow me to thank all of you for having joined us. I apologize that the length of our program did not really allow for a conversation, but I do hope that we will remain in touch. And should you wish to get in touch with one another, please let us know, and we will certainly facilitate that. I'd like to, particularly on behalf of all of us, thank the wonderful team at CETYS, Noe, Diego, and Carlota, and of course, President Fernando Leon Garcia. Have a wonderful day and evening and a year ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice evening or night.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.